and welcome to our panel on free democracy, security, and the spread of human rights. We've got a wonderful panel gathered to talk about defense spending and whether or not it makes us more safe at home and abroad. I will be your moderator this evening. My name is Alan LaPolice. I am a fifth-generation Kansas farmer, a combat veteran. I'm a lifelong educator, and I hold the peculiar distinction, I believe, of being the only candidate to run for federal office ever 3 times, once on the right, again in the middle, and then again on the left, without actually moving politically at all. And I argue that I didn't move, the parties did, and there's some truth to that, but the more precise reason that I did that was that my goal has always been the same, and that has been to bridge the divide and to preserve the union. So tonight, with the help of some very exceptional panelists, and with your welcome participation, let's talk about defense and try once again to bridge that divide. I'd like to start with 3 quick quotes in reverse chronological order. The first being from Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba. He's basically the Jeff Bezos of Asia. And he said back in 2017, in the past 30 years, America had 13 wars, spending $14.2 trillion. What if you spent part of that money on infrastructure? You're supposed to spend money on your own people. What if this money were spent on the Midwest of the United States, developing the industry there? It's not that other countries are stealing your jobs. It's your strategy. That was 4 years ago. An older quote from Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, and this is from September the 10th of 2001. No significance to the date, but this is the day that he said, September 10th, he said that according to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in defense transactions. Now you talk to people on the Hill and that number could be a lot higher at this point. And I'm sure that it's mostly an accounting error, but if you've got trillions of dollars that you cannot track, there should be some questions asked. And my last quote is from Eisenhower, and you would expect me to do the military-industrial complex quote, but Eisenhower's a Kansas man, and I'm a Kansas man, so I'm going to change up to a more preferable quote that I like. He said, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and not clothed." President Dwight D. Eisenhower during the halcyon days of what was once called a great America. So in introducing my panel, I would like you, the participants, viewers, to consider these 3 questions because it proved so important in the 1980 and the 2016 presidential races, that campaign motto of making America great. I want to ask, what exactly made America great? And when was America great? I'd also like to ask, what created the public trust and what has betrayed it? And then finally, what has changed in how the US deals with the world? And I want you to consider a concept known as Pax Americana, which basically is the idea that global peace comes from American leadership. With that, I'd like to introduce my first panelist, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. He was the Distinguished Adjunct Professor of Government and Public Policy at William & Mary. He is a retired U.S. Army colonel who served as Chief of Staff to former Secretary of State General Colin Powell. Much like General Ulysses S. Grant, Colonel Wilkerson had a tremendous sea change regarding U.S. military policy. And like our 18th president, Colonel Wilkerson spent a life serving on the front lines of that ongoing debate. Colonel Wilkerson, thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And let me make my words as concise and short as I can. Your lead-in was perfect as far as I'm concerned. I want to take a second and emphasize the part about what we have become, which is an empire. But worse than that, we've turned our democracy. You know, it can be an empire, you can act imperially, you can bring about a Pax Americana, that's the positive aspect of it. But what we've done to our democracy is turned it into a national security state. And what that means is what you just exemplified in your remarks. Just in the last 20 years, we've probably spent $7 trillion on Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and a host of other lesser things like being in 9 different countries in the world where we are not constitutionally at war, but we're flying drones and on occasion kill people in those countries. This is a war crime. But the bigger aspect of it for me is the drain on our resources that these wars signify. And in terms of pollution, we talk a lot about the way money pollutes our political process, and it does. There's no question about that. But this money also pollutes our morals, our ethical standing. It pollutes our reputation. It corrupts our reputation all around the globe. I hear from Berlin, I hear from Paris, I hear from Tokyo, I hear from Seoul, I hear from all manner of other capitals of our allies and friends who tell me that they don't know what's happened to America. They have no idea why we're wasting all the money we're wasting. No idea why we're doing many of the things that we're doing. No idea why we had January the 6th, for example. And when I try to explain to them what my view of that is and why it's happening, they shudder and they wonder if they should stay allied with this country. They wonder whether they should even have relations with this country. And the only reason I submit to you that many of them are still in some sort of a relationship with us is because of our economic and financial power, which still is awesome, even with the incredible debt we have right now. And even though they all understand that it can't last forever. So it's a matter of time before these allies decide to cut loose. It's a matter of time before they move somewhere else. It's a matter of time before they find another power relationship in the world that appeals to them more than the one with us does. It's a very dangerous period. It's a doubly dangerous because we're confronting two of the most incredible threats we've ever conjured as a human race. Nuclear weapons, which are back on the agenda again, big time back on the agenda. We've just about destroyed all of our arms control. The only thing left is New START. And thank God Biden and Putin decided to renew that for 5 years. But that's it. And we have new players like North Korea. We have new players who aren't controlled by anything, not the Non-Proliferation Treaty or any other arms control measure. And then we're looking down the road at climate change. Yesterday, I attended a Naval War College webinar where the statement was made, and I think it's an accurate statement. We have already lost a battle with China we didn't even know we were in. This battle concerns solar lead in the world, solar power, and what the Chinese are doing as opposed to what we're doing. And that's just one example. We're behind the power curve on this existential challenge to the planet. Not necessarily to its existence. It'll stay here for another 4.8 or whatever billion years. But we may disappear from it, just as the dinosaurs did. So these incredible challenges are confronting us, and what are we doing? Wasting our resources, which we solely need in endless, stupid wars. That's my major point.
Thank you for that. And it's worth mentioning, too, that you say that these nations, these foreign nations, don't know where we're spending our money. Honestly, I'll guess that most of the viewers tonight, most of the American citizens, have no real idea where we're spending our money. They would be surprised at how many nations we drop bombs on, how many nations we are engaged with in illegal, unjustified military actions. So let me bring in panelist number 2. Nilmini Rubin is a senior associate on the Project for Prosperity and Development at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Nilmini served as senior advisor for global economic competitiveness at the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee, where she directed technology, energy, trade, and economic policy. On behalf of Representative Ed Royce, Republican, California, Nilmini spearheaded bipartisan legislation by the House of Representatives to promote internet access in developing countries, and she was successful. Welcome to the panel, Nilmini Rubin.
Thank you so much for having me.
I do want to introduce our third panelist, but I just quickly want to say bipartisan. You know, just any quick comment on this idea, this long forgotten idea of bipartisanship?
I think bipartisanship is possible again. It's really the only way to have policy that's sustainable. You know, it's just we're going to have whiplash back and forth if we keep passing things that are led and dominated by one party. We did it before in difficult times, and it's because people saw each other as people, and they worked together. You know, small groups of leaders. connecting. And so I do think that it's possible. It just takes a lot of work in dedication. And if the American people want our congressional system to be functional, they need to elect people that are interested in working to pass legislation and not just interested in press hits.
Thank you for that. Yeah. I had the good fortune of having Senator Bob Dole as a mentor for a while. And he mentioned too that anything that you pass that is partisan will only last as long as your party's in power. And this notion of bipartisan was something that he crafted quite well. So thank you for that. And now let me bring in Rachel Goodman. Good evening, Rachel. Ms. Goodman is counsel with Project Democracy, where she leads a team focused on combating the threat that disinformation poses to our democracy. Prior to Project Democracy, she spent nearly 8 years as a litigator with the Racial Justice Program of the ACLU. There, she focused on economic justice issues, particularly on discrimination in housing and lending, and on technology-driven discrimination. Welcome to the panel.
Thanks so much, Alan. Glad to be here.
I do have to ask too, technology-driven discrimination. I have a history as an educator, and we use technology-driven decision-making for good, and you saw it used for evil. Anything to say about that?
Sure. You know, I think there's a widely held misperception in the American public that anything that is done by technology is inherently sort of value neutral and scientific, but of course it's not. And any technology or software is designed and loaded with the thinking and sometimes the biases that are reflected in the data that trains software and algorithms and in the minds of the people who created the software. And so to try to move toward the creation of sort of neutral software in a world where we all bring a lot of non-objective material to our thinking, and data sets reflect, you know, one of the biggest examples that people can sort of see easily is when you translate on Google Translate, right, into languages where nouns are gender specific. If you use the word nurse in English, right, translation tools will often turn that into the sort of female version of the sentence, whereas if you use doctor, it'll be the male version of the sentence. And that's just because uncorrected data sets might, you know, not with anyone's intention, lead there. And to sort of bring it back to where we are tonight, I mean, I think there's a lot in thinking about the way digital disinformation can undermine democracy. You know, when the software that has fueled the spread of a lot of this stuff around the internet is designed, it's not designed maliciously or malevolently, but it has the effect of amplifying the information that is not necessarily the information you would want to create a healthy and politically responsive democracy.
So it seems that sometimes that those biases are baked into the batter, if you will, or baked into the cake. Let me go back to Colonel Wilkerson. You've got this history working with the National Security Administration, and your dealings with and your opinion of the NSA have changed dramatically since your days inside of it. Was there a specific event that marked this transition?
There were. First, let me say, most Americans I talk to, and I've been all across the country in all 50 states before the pandemic, don't even know that the National Security Agency doesn't belong to anybody but the Secretary of Defense. They're stunned when I tell them that. The only thing that doesn't belong to the Secretary of Defense in the U.S. intelligence community is the DNI and the CIA. Most everything else belongs to the Secretary of Defense, 85% of the 100 million plus intelligence budget. So that's the first problem I have, is that the Defense Department is supervising the greatest violation of American civil rights probably that's occurred in our history, at least in terms of the blanket and comprehensive coverage. And we've had people from the NSA lie to the United States Congress about that very fact. Not that they haven't lied in the past about different things, but that's particularly alarming when you know what's actually happening. I was on several working groups in the State Department, one on North Korea, for example, where I know what the NSA can do. I know, for example, what their financial services team can do. Eliminate your bank account tomorrow morning if they want to, and eliminate you along with it. This is how powerful this agency is, and it needs to understand that operating domestically and operating in the way that it did after the Patriot Act and after 9/11, while perhaps for a short time understandable in the crisis we confronted, is not understandable in the long term. It's as simple as you can have liberty or you can have security. If you sacrifice your liberty in order to have security, you're sucking, you're hurting. And that's what a lot of people wanted to do. Unfortunately, polls, even as late as 2008 and 2009, showed that 50 to 52 to 54, depending on the poll, percent of Americans thought that what was being done was okay, including torture, which is a clear war crime. We signed a treaty. We ratified that treaty, a UN treaty, and we broke that treaty. We broke that law.
We've broken it time and time again, I think. So the NSA seems to be limitless in their scope. And after Truman, some brilliant, I think it was a lobbyist that said, "Why do we keep disarming and then rearming? Why don't we just stay armed? Let's just stay armed all the time." And that was the birth of the national security state that we have now. Is there any force that we know of that could rein in the NSA? If it's all within the executive, if it's all how it's there, wouldn't a functioning legislative that wasn't so busy fighting each other over, what I'd consider some nonsensical, opinion differences, could they regulate at this point national security agency?
Could the Congress regulate the national security state?
Could they draw it back?
Yeah, I think they could do a better job than they do, but they can't because they're indebted to it. Their money comes from the members of that national security state. Not for nothing did they pay the CEO of Lockheed Martin something like $35 million when you count up all her benefits, all her stock options, and so forth this last year. That's about 350 times her floor workers, if you will. That's unconscionable. And they just produced an aircraft that cost $100 million a copy, cost trillions over its life cycle. And yesterday I read the fully mission capable rates, which are probably a lie. The Air Force, they're not going to tell you the truth about FMC, but it's only 60%. And it's probably more like about 50%. This is a $100 million airplane that won't do its full mission, but about half the time. This is where we are now. We're to the point where 6 main contractors, led by Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Grumman, Boeing, and so forth, more or less dictate what a product costs to the American taxpayer. It's monopoly. It's monopoly. One's a prime, the other's the sub, then the other's the prime, and the other's the sub. And they make products that are sorry, and they sell them at a major price. That's the definition of monopoly. It's crony capitalism at its worst, but they feed a lot of money into the committee chairmen, into the senators and individual representatives, into their PACs and so forth. And frankly, I don't know how you break out of that unless you get rid of the money. You have to get rid of the money.
Then let's go down that path real quick. Let's say we're someone to propose a 28th Amendment, limiting spending, making it transparent, basically saying money is not protected constitutionally as speech. Could that, in effect, change the course of our military spending? How about
I think getting money out, reversing Citizens United in all of its spirit and its reality. And if an amendment to the Constitution, 28th Amendment, does that, I'm all for it, because that's the first step in arresting the power of this state and endless stupid wars and all the things that those things mean. It means money going to infrastructure, money going to education, money going to healthcare, instead of all these endless stupid wars and the products that make those wars pursuable.
Thank you, sir. I'm asked to solicit questions from the audience, so if anybody has a question, they're welcome to submit them in the chat box, and we'll try to give them to the panelists. But I'd like to move back to Nilmini. At American Promise, we were very glad to work with you in the Fix the System Coalition last year. But most of your work has been in international affairs and national security. So what do you see as the connection between a strong American democracy and national security with our international relations?
The job I had before leading Fix the System, which was a coalition of groups that cared about reforming democracy, was leading the international energy division of an international consulting company. And we had projects around the world doing stuff that I was massively proud of, like bringing first-time internet or energy access to people who've never had that. And we worked in difficult countries. And what made me nervous was listening to the local news here in the US and hearing things that rhymed with what was happening in failed states. And it kept me up at night because I was like, this is very familiar in a bad way. And I started volunteering on democracy reform with a few different groups, and then just realized I had to flip my life and focus on democracy reform in the US and volunteer on the international. The reason why I care about democracy here is really from this national security perspective. Like, we cannot be strong in our defense. We can't be strong in our economic health. We can't perpetuate our American morals abroad if we have a failing democracy here at home. We've seen around the world that democracies are safer. There's less conflict. There's less wars perpetuated by democratic states. And I just really get nervous when some of the good work that we are doing abroad is not backed up by what we're living here at home. And I just think that there's a very, very clear link between the health of our country and our democracy and our national security.
I want to follow up by saying, we are still a democracy, though we are a flawed democracy. I think that was the report. And we were safer. We felt safety over the past, 3, 4, 5 decades, even more, back to post-World War II. Are we safe? Are we safe with as much as we spend? Are we safe with the information that we get? Is disinformation and the way we spend our money, is it actually threatening our domestic security rather than strengthening it?
I think that overall, when you're comparing safety and security across the world, we here who are fortunate enough to be in the United States are safer. We do need to maybe recalibrate what we spend on. The Defense Secretary Gates, back in the day when he was testifying on the Hill, talked about funding the State Department, and that funding for the State Department was really important because it reduced the number of bullets that he needed to buy. And we just need to think about the whole panoply of national security spending as not just spending through defense, but also being very thoughtful and strategic about cost-saving measures that we can be spending on abroad that include the State Department and USAID and other foreign assistance efforts. And we have all these incredible lessons learned through our work on disinformation in the former Soviet Union or Eastern Europe, through addressing democracies and building democracies around the world through IRI and NDI, the Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute. We have a lot of lessons learned, and we really need to figure out how to pull in what we've learned that works around the world and apply it to the United States. Because those are really important benchmarks. We can't just be benchmarking within the United States. We need to really make sure we're world class and continue to be world class.
When you think of disinformation, you think of these totalitarian states like Russia with the GRU and with RT national television. I want to bring Rachel in because that's your area, disinformation. So let me ask, your work at Project Democracy focuses on disinformation and how it erodes the shared reality that forms the basis of our democracy. So the very fabric of our reality is altered through disinformation. Can you tell us more about that work and how you think about that level of a problem?
Yeah, and I should say not to overcorrect on, it's actually Protect Democracy rather than Project Democracy, which is
it does say that
missions in the name. No, that's okay. We have thought a lot. Our organization was founded in 2017, and I think although it looked externally for a while like it was kind of an combating the Trump administration organization, that the organization's thesis was always that Trump was a symptom rather than a cause of, a long trajectory of democratic decay in the United States. And after the 2020 election, we were able to really sort of step back and say, what are the drivers of those longer term trends, and how do we need to think about combating those drivers and not just sort of the immediate crises and assaults on democracy that were, such a daily part of the experience under the Trump administration. And, disinformation we view as really a key part of that. If you think about January 6th, I mean, I know a number of folks, that's come up a couple times on the panel, but without a shared reality or a shared understanding, just to take one example of what happened in an election, we're ungovernable. And, January 6th was this very public, very visible manifestation of what it means to have, a significant minority of Americans who really see sort of the full spectrum of American governmental institutions as fully illegitimate, based on, both kind of top-down and bottom-up misinformation and disinformation campaigns. And that kind of thinking has become so central to the way a lot of people see politics and the polity and the government that it's hard to see a way forward without attacking those root causes, we think.
But there must be a way. I mean, that's what I hope Protect Democracy focuses on. What are some common sense approaches? I mean, when we get our news from different news sources, and it's broadcast news with advertising dollars, and again, there's that influence of money because they've got to get ratings. How do we share the reality that is the real reality, and how do we even determine what it is?
Yeah. It's a good question. I still believe there is an objective reality, which, by the way, so do most Americans. If you ask them that, right? They just disagree about what it is. There's always been misinformation, disinformation in the not only in our democracy but in every society and moment in history. And I'm sure others on the panel wiser than I can talk more about that. One of the things that's really fundamentally changed is the speed and the virality and the distribution networks for that disinformation, and the digital platforms that kind of monopolize so much of our attention now are a big part of that. So, kind of to go back to the theme of what is too big and ungovernable, you kind of come back at it from a different perspective when you think about tech. There actually is pretty widespread bipartisan agreement, although framed differently through different folks, that the amount of power that the major tech platforms wield over American political discourse is not tenable, and whether you attack that from sort of an antitrust perspective or needing to break up those companies and get some more competition in that market, or whether you look more on the kind of rules of engagement, transparency, content moderation side of things. I think there's pretty widespread agreement that that's an important place to start.
And it is worth starting because yeah, the pervasiveness of big tech. It seems that's a bipartisan issue that we can all get behind. And I wonder, with social media, with Twitter and Facebook, are they just algorithms that just want to grow the number of likes and shares and tweets, or I mean, is there something more to it where it's just more profitable when people argue? I mean, when people are scared, when they move into their camp, and if that's the case, I mean, wouldn't that be justification for legislative action, and specifically to, like you said, break up big tech and arrest the influence of that big tech money?
Yeah, I mean, so it's very important to us in thinking about these issues from kind of a democracy first perspective that the First Amendment is also a really central part of that, right? And one thing that's kind of scary about this is you have the concentration both of these tools that do kind of organically emphasize outrage and the angrier, the more engagement kinds of things, but then also actual decisions that the platforms do make to take down particular kinds of content based on their sense of the prevailing politics and sort of the kinds of punishments they may get from Congress or other actors. So antitrust kinds of solutions and corporate power solutions end up being in a certain way the most values neutral, right? Like, we don't think the right answer is for Congress to be legislating anything that looks like what can stay up and what can come down and what the rules are, and that's how you get back there.
But going back to antitrust, if there were more competition in the marketplace, if there were more platforms that people could get on, then you would sort of take away that monopoly power that exists in the hands of a few tech giants. And can you do that when those tech giants have unnecessary influence over the members who would actually act to break up or to regulate those big tech giants?
I'd be really interested to hear the other panelists' takes. I mean, in a funny way, it's kind of the opposite of where the national security state is, right? I think there's a unified sense across the political spectrum that big tech is the bad guy, whereas there's this sort of weirdly unified sense on the other, with respect to military spending, that's the thing nobody's going to touch. But I'm curious what others think.
Colonel Wilkerson, I know that you know warfare, and you know Putin, and he figured out a long time ago that information was power. He figured out a long time ago that the future of warfare wasn't your traditional I have more airplanes than you have. And are we missing something that that maybe Putin had caught on to a while back?
Well, I think Vladimir Putin has been very shrewd. I'd compare him to a master chess player who's playing multiple games at the same time. And we've made enough strategic errors that we've made his 1 and 2 and 3 game really successful. And he's done it with almost nothing except a gas station. He has not a formidable military. He has not a formidable array of forces, financial, economic, and otherwise, at his hand, other than Gazprom. But he has really wreaked havoc on the EU, on the relationship of NATO and the transatlantic relationship. NATO is on the verge right now of having some really serious problems. It's expanded itself to the extent that it couldn't possibly. No one would possibly invoke Article 5 and be serious about it. What American is going to die for Tbilisi? What American is going to die for Kyiv? What American is going to die, for that matter, for Helsinki or Oslo? I mean, it's ridiculous what we've done, and Putin has flowed into every single strategic crack that we've made and exploited it. He's done a marvelous job. And one of the ways he's done it is, as Rachel was saying, is with disinformation. Finding those little truths within our democracy that are weak, unless they're defended vigorously and with courage and with consistency, they're weak, and he's exploiting them. We haven't had a situation like this since 1850. We've not had a situation where all 3 branches of government were in the hands of, effectively, a minority, a very large and powerful minority, but a minority. We haven't had a position where, or a situation in the country where politically we're split roughly 50-50. Look at the election. 75 million people voted for Donald Trump. This is 1850 to 1860 all over again, and it's most political scientists will tell you that it's impossible to rule any type of democracy, whether it's a federal republic like ours or it's a tiny one like Switzerland or Denmark, if you're 50-50. You can't achieve anything. You can't achieve compromise. You can't do anything because one side thinks the other side is the mortal enemy and vice versa. That's where we are right now. And Rachel and Nilmini are right that we need to get out of that. We need to break that. And how we break that, I think, one significant way we break that is get the money out of politics, get the money out of a lot of these things because it's polluting and corrupting everything that happens. You can't move if you aren't extremely powerful in terms of money. Look at Maine. Recently, Maine had a situation where so much out-of-state money flowed into the state to defeat Susan Collins that Mainers were going around saying, "You got to be kidding me. We've never had a Senate race that topped $2 million. $100 million or so flowed into Maine. And it's not Mainers. It's out-of-state people doing it. That's no way to make your democracy in Maine work. Certainly not. And that's what we're doing to ourselves right now. We're letting this money just take over everything. The Supreme Court made as bad a decision as it's made in its history. And that's saying something when it essentially put out Citizens United.
And that's it. We've got a Congress now that's abdicated responsibility. They can't do anything about it because every member of Congress is too busy, chasing that money or not saying anything that might get used by a super PAC against them. They don't come out in favor of any bold policy because it becomes a soundbite that some out-of-state PAC is going to use to defeat them in the next primary. Not even in the next general, but in the next primary. And so again, it comes down to we've got a political system where we've got gridlock and we've got a national security apparatus that's spending our money making us less safe abroad. And the only way out, I think, is as we've identified. It's just you got to pull the plug on that money and you got to identify what solutions do we have in common to make us safer. And y'all need to stop fighting and do the job of a legislature. Nilmini, what are your thoughts again on a way forward?
One way forward that connects some of the dots that the Colonel and Rachel have already brought up is the Honest Ads Act. It's a bipartisan bill, and it would apply the same standards that we have in the traditional media to social media on political ads. And I think it's time social media has matured from an infancy to kind of being a wild teenager to recognize that social media is media. And all of the rules that apply to media really do need to apply. The transparency of who's funding what pieces of information are critical in traditional media, and it's critical in social media. So I do think that it's very important that we move forward on the Bipartisan Honest Ads Act.
I couldn't agree more. And I mean, they say that it's too onerous trying to regulate that and keep the public folder filled with who's spending on which ads. But maybe that's a problem. If you can't keep track of who's spending money on which ads, then the problem is one step back. Why are they spending so much money on these ads that you can't track? It goes back to the DOD.
I push back on that idea of too onerous. We're talking about some of the most profitable companies on earth.
Yep.
And if they can't ensure that their product is safe for society, then they need to do something drastically different.
Couldn't agree more. Ray, you had any comment on that?
Yeah, I very much agree with that, and I think this is just what Nilmini was saying. But that it's a choice to spend less resources or a limited amount of resources to do the work. They certainly have the resources to make it not onerous and fully practical. And I just add sort of one more idea into this mix that hasn't really come up. It's something I think about a lot in disinformation, which is just the way it's not only that these systems create sort of algorithmic amplification of disinformation, but also that they're designed for advertising purposes to segment and separate, right? And so that, politicians for the first time in history have really strategic, sort of surgical ways of showing certain ads to certain demographics, and presenting themselves really differently. And those realities are not sort of visible or auditable by anyone without these kinds of regulatory mechanisms. So it introduces a kind of deception in elections that I think is really new.
Yeah, and you'd like to think in the original democracy, the longest standing constitutional republic, that we'd be above that we would have a solution to something like that. And yet here we are. And I do think that we have a solution. And I want to thank each of you. I think a solution that we can all get behind is what American Promise stands for, which is a constitutional amendment to regulate reasonably the influence of money, big money, and it just gets bigger every cycle. Doesn't seem to stop. Colonel Wilkerson, any final thought as we move out of the panel?
My final thought is to tell everyone to read Thomas Piketty's new book, Capital and Ideology. It's a fascinating. I'm on my third read of it now. I'm trying to do the mathematical language now, the charts in it, but it's so stunning when you see 5,000 years of human history, and particularly our history over the last 150 years, and how we have allowed in this country, in France and in other countries, the inequality regime, as he calls it, that is the maldistribution of wealth, to get so terribly bad. It is worse now in 2021 than it was in 1929. We have 0.001, as President Biden said the other day, percent of America. That's about 330,000 people who have more money than the rest of the country. At least 50 to 60% of the rest of the country. It's stunning how we've allowed this to happen. And that money just buys influence every day.
In plain sight. Yeah, I was looking back. I believe I have Piketty on the shelf. So that's the recommendation. Work with American Promise and read Piketty. Nilmini, any final thoughts?
Well, just thank you so much for having me. This has been a great conversation.
I've enjoyed it tremendously. Thank you for your insight. We didn't get to any questions from the audience, but I know that everybody they have the work to do. Rachel, final thoughts on you seem pretty optimistic, so give us something good to go on.
I think we have a moment. I do think we have not yet lost the moment of opportunity that is created when really all thinking Americans in their heart of hearts saw what happened with the 2020 election. And I don't know. I've never worked in Congress, but it seems to me that at a moment where there's this infrastructure bill on the table that we know the overwhelming majority of Americans support, that there's got to be something that moves forward together.
For what it's worth, a lot of them fear that if they do support it, they'll lose their primary. Thank you for that. I want to leave us with one final quote from one of my personal heroes, James, to 1795 for this. Of all the enemies of true liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded, because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes, and armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. In war, too, the discretionary power of the executive is extended. Its influence in dealing out offices, honors, and emoluments is multiplied, and all the means of seducing the minds are added to those of subduing the force of the people. No nation can preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. And I want to say it's no accident that big money drives disunity, division, disinformation, cynicism, and it forms a visible disconnect between we the people and our government. Defense spending is by no means the biggest lobby anymore, but they are the oldest and the most well-established, and they led the way for all the others, from pharma to financial services to oil, technology, healthcare, even my favorite, agriculture. And for far too long, we've effectively sold out our ambassadorships to the biggest donors, and we've allowed contractors to set foreign agendas. And that formula is having an impact on our democracy today. However, the good news is that today, in Congress like this NCLC, the people are unifying on solutions, connecting, committing, and acting behind the American Promise Amendment and all of the other necessary reform projects addressing our right to a government of, for, and by we the people. We are renewing our national ideals, committing to service and to the common good, and we are uniting and healing and working to ensure the American promise of a brighter future. I thank our incredibly talented panel, their insight. Thank you all for being part of this topic. I want to thank all of the volunteers of the American Promise, and everybody continue to go forth in the good work. Thank you all. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Take care.